What can we learn from our forever war in Ukraine? Chaz Freeman is former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security during the Clinton administration. His 30-plus years in the United States Foreign Service included posts as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires in the American embassies in both Bangkok and Beijing, and Director for Chinese Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Ambassador Freeman was the principal American interpreter during President Richard Nixon's path-breaking visit to China.
Thank you very much, Paul, both for having me here and for the very thoughtful introduction. I'm going to go right into this. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I wish your cause well. It's been a while since the United States won a war, and it looks as though we're about to lose yet another one, the war in Ukraine. This is a proxy war justified as an effort to, quote, weaken and isolate Russia. Our strategic defeat in this effort now leaves us with three unpalatable alternatives. We can continue to support Ukraine as Russia grinds it to bits and reduces it further in size and population. We can escalate the war, as French President Emmanuel Macron has advocated, despite the Russian threat to answer this with counter-escalation, possibly to the nuclear level. Or we can face up to failure and save what we can of Ukraine by negotiating with Russia. I know which of these choices I'd prefer, and I suspect you do too. And however this unwise and unnecessary war ends, we need to ensure that there are no more like it in future. They say that a mistake is only a mistake if you don't learn from it. Our country's recently made a lot of mistakes in its foreign policies, but sadly, we don't seem to be learning much of anything from these experiences. We have instead invented something uniquely American called a forever war. Such wars routinely fail, yet we keep launching them. I want to speak to you this evening about why we do this, why we shouldn't, and how we can stop doing it. My focus will be the forever war with Russia in Ukraine. Forever wars can take many forms. They can be economic or technological, like the one the Trump administration kicked off against China, and that the Biden administration has enthusiastically doubled down on. They can be military, like our 23-year global war on terrorism. That's taken us into combat in over 80 countries, killed over 900,000 people, and cost us an estimated $8 trillion. Forever wars need not be direct, as our proxy war in Ukraine illustrates. They can even be covert, as our multiple barely concealed interventions in Syria demonstrate. What America's forever wars have in common is that they involve muddled, open-ended objectives, movable goalposts, an intensely propagandized narrative to mobilize support for them, no quarter for those who challenge that narrative, no benchmarks for judging success or failure, no limits to the level of resources we must commit to them, no defined end state that would justify ending them, no strategy for their termination, and no vision of a feasible order if and when they actually end. Sun Tzu argued that wars should implement strategies that achieve specific national objectives with the least destruction. Karl von Clausewitz described war as the expedient continuation of politics by other means. William Tecumseh Sherman said that the purpose of war was to produce a better peace. Freddie Clay said every war must end. But what if domestic political dysfunction prevents the definition of specific national objectives? What if a country's political culture dictates that the only effective way to impose its druthers on other countries is coercively, through warfare, economic or military? What if such a country measures the success of punitive measures not by the extent to which they achieve desirable changes in foreign behavior, but by the pain they inflict on those foreigners. What if such a country believes it can resort to the use of force with impunity whenever it judges that less violent methods of bending foreigners to its will are less likely to do so? What if that country's wars routinely lead not to peace, but to turmoil or anarchy? Our forever wars are the product of applying hubris to two related national ambitions vis-a-vis the world beyond our borders. One, the consolation of a global American sphere of influence. And two, the foreign regime changes needed to realize this. The Ukraine war exemplifies both elements of this hegemonic behavior. It has been accompanied by wall-to-wall propaganda that confuses self-righteousness with truth, demonizes our adversary, and replaces analysis with wishful thinking and denial, leaving nothing certain and everything plausible. As always, the most destructive lies are those we tell ourselves. The Ukraine war is not, as is claimed, about democracy versus authoritarianism. It is about delineating the post-Cold War U.S. sphere of influence in Europe. Our country invented the modern concept of the sphere of influence. In the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary to it, we asserted a right to limit the freedom of maneuver of the countries of the Western Hemisphere and to demand their deference to our political and economic interests. After World War II, Americans expanded our sphere of influence to include Western Europe and Northeast Asia. In the post-Cold War period, Washington adapted the hegemonic principles of the Monroe Doctrine to the so-called unipolar moment and extended our sphere of influence to the entire world beyond the borders of Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. In the end, the only countries bordering Russia other than those of Central Asia not in our sphere of influence were Georgia and Ukraine. American neoconservatives saw these neighbors of Russia as vacuums to be filled by U.S. military power. During the Cold War, NATO was a purely defensive alliance that very effectively protected Western Europe from a predatory Soviet Union and its restive satellites. But 25 years ago, at the end of the 20th century, after the USSR had disappeared, NATO began to launch offensive operations. First against Serbia, then in Afghanistan, then and later in Libya. And as NATO expanded toward Russia's borders, American troops and weapons aimed at Russia routinely established a presence on the territory of NATO's new members. At the 2007 Munich Security Conference, Russian President Vladimir Putin bluntly warned the United States and its European allies that his country would feel obliged to act if NATO, the instrument by which the US has long exercised dominant political military influence in Europe, were further expanded. His warning echoed that of his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, as early as 1994. In 2008, as in 1994, Washington ignored these warnings and persuaded NATO to offer membership to Georgia and Ukraine, both of which border the Russian Federation. As the Russians have a habit of saying, it was no accident that shortly thereafter war broke out between Georgia and Russia. This was in part due to Georgia's exuberant reaction to apparent open-ended American support for its nationalist objectives. But more to the point, it was a calculated Russian signal of resolve to resist encirclement by the United States and NATO. We dismissed the signal and portrayed Moscow's defeat of Georgian adventurism as wanton Russian aggression that vindicated our determination to bring Russia's neighbors into NATO. Someone summed this up at the time by declaring that the reason NATO still exists is to handle the problems that NATO's continuing existence creates. Coincident with the war in Georgia, the United States and NATO escalated the effort to re-equip, restructure, and retrain the Ukrainian armed forces to be ready for combat with Russia In 2014, Washington helped engineer a coup in Kyiv that overthrew the elected government and installed hand-picked pro-American, anti-Russian successors in its place. The new ultra-nationalist Ukrainian government then banned the use of Russian and other minority languages like Hungarian or Romanian in education or for official business. But almost 30% of Ukrainians are native speakers of Russian. Russian-speaking secessionists in the Donbass region resisted forced assimilation and began a civil war with Ukrainian ultranationalists. This soon became a proxy war between Russia and the West. The United States reaffirmed our intention to bring Ukraine into NATO and stepped up our aid to the Ukrainian armed forces. But if Ukraine were to enter NATO while Crimea was still part of it, the 250-year-old Russian naval base at Sevastopol would fall under the control of the United States and NATO. In large measure to preempt this, Russia annexed Crimea. It was able to do so without violence because Crimeans had made it clear on several previous occasions in referenda that they did not want to be part of Ukraine. In 2014, a Russian-organized referendum revealed that the views of most Crimeans had not changed. If they could not be independent, they preferred to be part of Russia. It is, I think, utterly unrealistic to expect them ever to agree to place themselves once again under Ukrainian sovereignty. By 2021, with our help, Ukraine had acquired a NATO-trained and equipped army larger than the armed forces of Britain, France, and Germany combined. Not surprisingly, Moscow viewed this huge hostile force on its western borders as a serious national security threat. Recent attacks deep into Russia by Ukrainian forces have inadvertently validated Russia's concerns about the consequences of Ukraine joining an alliance hostile to it. Just as Soviet forces stationed in Cuba in 1962 menaced Washington, U.S. forces stationed in Ukraine could reduce the warning time of a strike on Moscow to about 5 minutes. So in December 2021, Moscow massed troops on the Russian border with Ukraine and demanded negotiations to resolve its security concerns. It insisted on Ukrainian neutrality, respect for the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, and a discussion of a new European security architecture that would threaten neither Russia nor the members of NATO. The US and NATO responded by rejecting negotiations while warning, in an instance of self-fulfilling paranoia, that Russia planned to invade Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, put it this way. He said, quote, President Putin sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was a precondition for Russia not invading Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that, unquote. In fact, the US and NATO refused to discuss it at all, leaving Russia with the choice of either accepting NATO membership for Ukraine and the eventual deployment of US forces there, or using force to prevent this. This unwelcome choice was the proximate cause of Moscow's fateful decision to invade Ukraine on February 22, 2022. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was clearly illegal under international law, but to say that it was unprovoked defies credibility. Could a negotiation with Russia have prevented war? We have at least two solid pieces of evidence to suggest that it might have. Despite Moscow's sympathy and support for the Russian-speaking secessionists in the Donbass, it agreed in the Minsk Accords of 2014 and 15 that their region should remain part of Ukraine, provided their linguistic autonomy was guaranteed, much as the case of Quebec, where French is guaranteed to the local inhabitants in the Canadian Federation. The Minsk Accords were, however, subsequently repudiated, not by Russia, but by Ukraine, France, and Germany. Then, too, about 6 weeks after it invaded Ukraine, Moscow actually agreed to a draft treaty with Kyiv by which it would withdraw from Ukraine in return for Ukraine renouncing NATO membership and proclaiming neutrality. This treaty was to have been signed on April 15, 2022, but the US, UK, and NATO objected to it. In early April, Ukraine therefore repudiated its earlier agreement to the terms of the treaty. As the war has ground on, Russia has repeatedly reiterated its willingness to talk, and the US, NATO, and Ukraine have consistently rejected doing so. The refusal to discuss a formula for peaceful coexistence between Ukraine and Russia, between NATO and Russia, and between Ukrainian and Russian-speaking Ukrainians has had very grave consequences, most of all for Ukraine. The war has not only imposed huge costs on Ukraine, but also greatly weakened its bargaining power in any future negotiation with Russia. If there is an agreed end to this war, it will be on largely Russian terms and vastly less favorable to Ukraine than the peace the US and NATO persuaded Kyiv to reject in April 2022. Ukraine, the US, and NATO are now in the final stages of a humiliating strategic defeat. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the population of Ukraine was about 32 million. Since then, it has fallen to about 20 million. 1/3 of Ukraine's people have been dislocated. Over 2 million have fled to Russia, and 6 to 8 million to the West and elsewhere. The number of Ukrainian casualties is a closely guarded secret, but indications are that it may be around 500,000. Ukraine's industrial base and infrastructure have been devastated. As the war began, Ukraine was the poorest and most corrupt country in Europe. Now it is even poorer and more corrupt. The Biden administration has regularly described the proxy war with Russia as designed to isolate and weaken Russia, and pledged to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, or more recently, as long as we can. Prominent American politicians have extolled the benefits of having Ukrainians rather than Americans die fighting Russians. Ukrainians have done so with remarkable bravery, but so many have died that Ukraine can no longer mount an adequate defense, let alone go on the offensive. The war has devastated Ukraine without either isolating or weakening Russia. It's cut Europe off from Russian energy supplies and reoriented Russia toward China, India, Iran, the West Asian Arab countries, and Africa. Russia's economy has grown, not contracted. Moscow's defense budget has doubled, and its armament production is now 3 times that of the United States and NATO combined. Like Ukrainian casualties, those of Russia are hard to estimate, but with a population 4 to 5 times larger than Ukraine's, Russia can sustain many more casualties than Ukraine can. The United States and NATO evidently expected an easy victory over Russia, but both now face a humiliating military defeat. The war has greatly weakened Ukraine's bargaining position in any future negotiation with Russia. Germany now feels sufficiently threatened for it to have begun a debate on whether to acquire its own nuclear weapons. As a result of US sanctions and the sabotage of Russia's undersea gas pipeline to Germany, Europe has lost its access to cheap Russian energy supplies. These have been replaced by imports from the United States that are as much as 4 times as expensive. European energy-intensive industries are no longer internationally competitive. Germany, Europe's core economy, is being deindustrialized. Current trends raise disturbing questions about the future of the European Union. The Ukraine war, combined with other bellicose actions, has cost the United States and the West the moral argument internationally. We cannot have it both ways, condemning Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine while actively supporting Israel's even more lawless and lethal actions in Palestine. The West has inadvertently put its hypocrisy and double standards on dramatic display. We're told by our leaders and their political strap hangers that Ukraine and other current and potential forever wars are about defending democratic values. But as we build a domestic national security state to support our wars, we are sacrificing ever more of the civil liberties and respect for due process and the rule of law that are central to constitutional democracy. As Benjamin Franklin wisely pointed out, a nation prepared to trade its freedoms for its security puts both in jeopardy. And in this case, it's not even our security that is at stake, but that of others. The domino theory was nonsense in Southeast Asia. It's equally fallacious in Eastern Europe. Our wars are wars of choice, not necessity, and have little or no direct connection to American security and well-being. It's said that U.S. credibility with allies and adversaries is at stake in Ukraine, but our policies and actions there have not bolstered confidence in American steadfastness, so much as shaken confidence in our judgment and cast doubt on the efficacy of our military doctrines and weaponry. The West now suffers from forever war fatigue. American and European taxpayers are becoming reluctant to keep sending money to a cause they increasingly perceive as both futile and corrupt. And as we are being reminded, and we are being reminded, I think, that as the 20th century demonstrated, there can be no peace in Europe based on ostracizing Russia or any other European great power, like the Weimar Republic in Germany. As the war proceeds, Russia's bargaining position continues to strengthen. If there's ever an end to this war, it will be on terms far less favorable to Ukraine than the peace the US and NATO persuaded it to reject in April 2022. Meanwhile, inept American diplomacy continues to push Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea together in a loose anti-American entente and to increase the danger of one or more nuclear wars. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, basis of NATO, stipulates that, quote, an armed attack against one or more NATO member states in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, unquote. This is an unequivocal commitment to defend any and all NATO members against attack. But the United States and other NATO members have already demonstrated that we are not, in fact, prepared to respond directly to an armed attack on Ukraine by Russia. In response to just such an attack, we have resorted to evasions and a proxy war pitting Ukrainians, but not us, against the aggressor. If Ukraine were a member of NATO, Article 5 would require the president to ask Congress to declare war on the world's most formidable nuclear power. Vladimir Putin has threatened to conduct such a war at the nuclear level. He may not be the demonic figure our propaganda makes him out to be, but bravado aside, calling his bluff is an insane risk for us to take for ourselves, our allies, and the world at large. As in other forever wars, we have inhaled our own propaganda about Ukraine. Our quixotic attempt to exploit Ukrainian nationalism to weaken and isolate Russia or engineer regime change in Moscow has been a catastrophe for Ukrainians and a strategic defeat for the West. It has brought the US and NATO to the point where we must either enter the fray directly, watch Russia grind Ukraine to bits, or accept a negotiated outcome that addresses Russian interests and objectives. Moscow has described those interests and stated those objectives clearly and consistently. They do not include invading NATO territory. Claiming that they do is threat-mongering designed to mobilize popular support in the West for our proxy war in Ukraine, to boost US and NATO defense budgets, and to fatten the profits of the military-industrial complex. Moscow has conducted a limited war. It called it a special military operation deliberately in Ukraine. It has not marshaled the forces necessary to subdue, occupy, or annex all of Ukraine. Russia's battlefield performance has not demonstrated any capacity to invade the West, and Moscow has expressed no ambition to do so. It is time to stop attributing objectives to Russia that it has not stated and does not have. Moscow's professed aims have been and remain, first, to restore the neutrality of Ukraine, and prevent the deployment of U.S. and other NATO forces and installations to Ukraine. Second, to restore and ensure the linguistic and other rights of Ukraine's large Russian-speaking minority. And third, to negotiate a new European security architecture that can alleviate the threat Russia and other European states pose to each other by crafting a durable peace between them. In the absence of diplomacy, the use of force has once again failed. Far from weakening Russia, the Ukraine war has strengthened it. Far from isolating Russia, the Ukraine war has forced it into the embrace of China and Iran and boosted its ties with India, the Arab world, and Africa. Ukraine's economy has been eviscerated, its population reduced, its military capacity gutted, and its territory diminished. If this war is allowed to continue, it will only wreak more havoc in Ukraine, kill more Ukrainians as well as Russians, and further shrink Ukraine's territory, possibly leaving it landlocked. The proponents of our militarized foreign policy asked us once again to give war a chance. We foolishly did. This has now left us with no alternative to trying diplomacy. We cannot hope to regain at the negotiating table what we have lost on the battlefield, but we must now strive to compose a peace with Russia that enables Ukraine to be both a buffer and a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe. That, not NATO membership, is the prerequisite for the emergence of a prosperous and democratic Ukraine, untainted by corruption. And that, not NATO membership for Ukraine, is the prerequisite for peace and stability in Europe. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that comprehensive perspective on Ukraine and how it fits into overall U.S. policy in the world. Thank you so much. Before we get to questions, well, first of all, let me just ask you a quick question, Ambassador Freeman. How many times has CNN or PBS or CBS or ABC invited you to comment on the war in Ukraine?
Never. That is part of the information war. Any dissenting view is suppressed or marginalized. So I think these media outlets all have viewpoints which reinforce the official narrative to one extent or another. And I'm sorry to say that one has to depend on independent sources, which are in danger of being deplatformed if they do what they should do, namely present an alternative viewpoint.
It's amazing. It wasn't even this bad during Vietnam.
No, and I remember that well, and not with great pleasure.
Yeah. Well, before I'm hoping people will have some questions. If you do, go to the reactions button down at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand, and we will work toward those. But before we get to the questions, I'm going to turn this for 3 minutes over to Brian. We like to use these webinars to mobilize support for peace and against militarism and against these terrible wars. So Brian, why don't you lead us in this next minute or two?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mr. Freeman, for your fantastic presentation and for joining us tonight and for taking questions. We're going to be getting to the Q&A in just a minute, but like Paul said, at Massachusetts Peace Action, we use community education to inform, but also to spur on public advocacy. And one way to do that is to write to your representatives in Congress. So we have 2 actions. I just put them in the chat section, and we will be sending out a follow-up email with these actions, as well as a copy of this recording, which we encourage you to share with your friends and your entire network to get the word out. Like Mr. Freeman just said, they're not having him on CNN, so we need to get this information out. person to person. But these two actions, which are incredibly easy to take, all you need to do is put in your name and your address so it knows who your member of Congress is, and you can send messages demanding that your members of Congress support a ceasefire and negotiations to end this bloody war in Ukraine. And also, Mr. Freeman, since you talked briefly about the hypocrisy of our support for Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, I included an action that will allow you to demand an immediate ceasefire, as well as a halt to all U.S. weapons to Israel, and the resumption of funding for UNRWA as really the only viable way to prevent widespread famine in Gaza. So please, I encourage all of you to take both of those actions. And just as a reminder, I will also send them out to you in a follow-up email. And we encourage you to share that as widely as possible. Fill up the inbox of your representative in the House and of your two senators. Demand change, demand an end to these forever wars. They don't work. They're incredibly immoral and incredibly expensive. And we need our politicians to hear that we don't support them.
Well, thanks very much, Brian. So in the chat, if you look for the message from Brian with the two links, that would be great. You can fill those in right now. And I'll give you just another 30 seconds to do so. If you agree with those messages that you want sent, please do fill them out. Everything helps at this point. As you know, there's some fluidity in the situation in Gaza right now. We have to push the positive dynamics going on as much as possible to prevent this from falling back into the continuation of the genocide going on right now. So thank you, Brian, and thanks everyone for filling those out. Let me go to the, we have a bunch of people lined up for questions here. Could we start with Donald Smith? Donald, would you like to ask your question? Brian, if you could unmute Donald Smith.
Okay, thank you very much for a great presentation, Mr. Freeman. I have two related questions. First, other diplomats and members of the government, are they hostile to you? Are there many who are friendly to you but are afraid to tell the truth? You know, can you get allies who would reveal the truth? And secondly, what are the risks that MAGA Republicans reveal the truth about this and cause Biden to lose because of this stupid war? Thank you.
Two responses. First, there are a lot of people in the diplomatic service of our country who are very distressed about these policies. But when you take the king's shilling, as it were, or I guess Uncle Sam's quarter, you're expected to behave. You're expected to defend U.S. policy. If you can't do that, you should resign. And we've actually had some people resign, starting with Josh Paul, who was a very senior guy in handling licensing for arms exports. He resigned over the war in Gaza, which he found it unconscionable that we were continuing to send weapons to be used for what is clearly a genocide. So there are lots of people in there, and I think they're probably staying in the system and doing what they can. But we have an administration that is, very hard over on these issues. It all comes down to the president. He's very clear where he stands. He wanted regime change in Russia. He's been adamant that we'll do whatever we can in Ukraine forever. And he's taken the same position of strong support for Israel, notwithstanding the fact that every time he tries to persuade Prime Minister Netanyahu of something, Netanyahu gives him the finger. The second question, the second question was, can't hear you. You've been
The second question was, what danger is this to Biden's reelection? And can MAGA Republicans, for example, tell some of the true story about this and embarrass the Democrats and win? That's what I'm afraid of.
I think the issue there is that Mr. Biden and the Democratic Party are losing the support of many young people, progressives, people of color, American Muslims, Arab Americans. And many of these people are in key states. And therefore, Mr. Biden is in effect digging his own grave by sticking with these policies, which much of his constituency objects to. And you look at the polls, and it's reflected in diminishing numbers for him among all these categories. Now, if he can't bring out the African-American vote, and the African-American churches are turning against him, then I think he's in real trouble. And we're going to end up with Donald Trump as our next president, which is something probably some of the audience would welcome, but I don't. I mean, I can't imagine a more erratic figure at the helm than that one.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Donald, and thanks, Chaz. So let's go to Clarette Carl. Clarette, do you have a question? Let us unmute you.
Hi, Clarette. We've talked on the phone years ago. You're still muted.
Brian, can you get Clarette unmuted there?
Yep, it should give you a prompt.
Oh, just go to your own.
There you are.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you? It's
Okay.
nice to see you, Ambassador, and nice to see Paul. I here in Boston, and continue to participate in MAPA actions along with my friends in the LaRouche movement and Schiller Institute. But I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, if you would, in the context of these forever wars, to address what seems to be developing now as a type of Asian NATO to force confrontation with China. And from the standpoint of my movement, we favor a development, peace through development perspective in terms of trying to organize both the populace as well as those powers that be around the idea that we can have a win-win approach to solving these problems, taking them outside of the military field and putting them in a more, a way where we can all act in such a fashion that we're not kids anymore, but adults and humans. So I'd like to know what you think about this orientation that we're initiating, which is a peace through development and economic cooperation.
Well, I have, I'm familiar, of course, with the Oasis plan, which your movement has put forward for the Middle East, and I think it's a very sensible plan. It's a shame that, as you are well aware, the LaRouche movement is not necessarily welcome everywhere or heard, because the idea is good, and ideas ought to stand on their own. With respect to China, I would say this. China is a challenge to the United States' position as the dominant power on the globe in this planet. It is a challenge to us economically. It actually produces 3 times as much manufacturers as we do now. 1/3 of the world's manufacturing is in China. We produce about 1/3 of that. So whatever that is, 1/9, I guess. Technologically, it is a challenge. China is graduating almost 4 million STEM workers, scientists, technologists, engineers, mathematicians every year. We graduate around 800,000, about 1/3 of whom are foreign, many of them Chinese. And we are claiming we're going to compete with that, but we're not pulling up our socks and getting our act together domestically. And you see now Prime Minister Kishida of Japan has been in Washington. And ironically, we're having to turn to the Japanese to supplement our manufacturing capability because we let it go. So These are challenges which are economic, technological, educational, cultural, if you will. And how do we respond militarily? That's irrelevant, wasteful. It's going to lead nowhere. It risks getting us into a war with China over what? Over the unfinished Chinese Civil War between the remnants of the Republic of China on Taiwan, where Chiang Kai-shek retreated in 1949 and has been under our protection ever since, and the mainland. And the Chinese are preparing for this war. They didn't want it, and I hope we don't want it, but it is exactly the sort of dangerous situation that we saw in August 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. Nobody wanted that war, but it happened, and it was unbelievably destructive. We get into a war with China, it's going to be nuclear. And I'm in Exeter, New Hampshire. I'll just get fallout, but you're in Boston, and you might think about it. Anyway.
I think that's a good thing to think about. Next would be Richard Krushnick.
Since the United States has been the overarching foreign policy of the United States, it seems, has been since sometime around 9/11/2001 to preserve as long as possible this unipolar world. And apparently, as you've been explaining to us, their lack of understanding of how far the world had already become multipolar and how their policies, militaristic policies, were not ill-conceived and wrong and led just to further defeat and weakening of the United States. It seems like even to this day, the realization of reality is not quite there yet in our leaders, our political and military industrial leaders. So I'm very worried that in any of these conflicts, either Ukraine or the Middle East or over Taiwan, that if anyone on this planet is likely to initiate the use of nuclear weapons, it's only the United States, because it's the United States that's losing in all three arenas. And I'm very concerned that our leaders are crazy enough that they will do this, that they will start with some tactical nuke somewhere and see what happens.
The answer, obviously, is to elect better leaders, but look at the choice we face in November. And you may be happy about it. I think you'd be one of the very few people in the country who was.
Well, I'm certainly wouldn't be happy.
No, I didn't think so.
No, no.
I think this is a case where the people are once again ahead of the leadership. I think many Americans do appreciate that the European dominance of the globe, which began in 1492 with Columbus and the beginning of the conquest of the Americas and went on to the conquest of almost everywhere. There's a wonderful map that shows the 17 countries in the world that Britain did not invade. And it does not include Tibet, but they invaded Tibet. But this era is over. 500 years of Atlantic dominance of the world is over. So is the unipolar moment is gone. There are other countries are coming up. We are going to have to get used to a world in which we cannot force others to follow us with force, with power. We have to set a better example. And if we set a better example, they will follow us.
You're not answering my question. My question is, how likely is it that the U.S. is going to use nuclear weapons?
Well, our nuclear doctrine involves first use. And we have a major $1 trillion nuclear modernization program going on, which includes developing dial-up and dial-down bombs where you can determine the extent of the explosion on the spot. These are intended for tactical use. And people are talking now. The head of the U.S. Army just said, well, we're going to put missiles in East Asia. He didn't say who would want us to put them on their territory to shoot at China. And you think those are going to be conventionally armed? No way. So, I mean, I think you're right. The danger, the principal danger, certainly in East Asia, because the Chinese have a no first use doctrine. They will not use nuclear weapons unless they are used against them. And we don't. The Russians have a sort of halfway position. They will use nuclear weapons, they say, if they're going down in defeat and the existence of their country is threatened, but not otherwise. So, but we don't make that distinction. So I think your concerns are well placed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Let's take a question from way out there in Western Massachusetts with John Berkowitz.
Need to be unmuted. Oh, okay.
There we go.
I thought Brian was doing that. Sorry.
No problem.
First of all, about media gaslighting and censorship of your voice, I want to just celebrate the fact, not that they're doing that to you, but that your colleague at Watson Institute, Stephen Kinzer,
oh yeah,
who has done a program, a webinar just like this for MAPA, well, at least he can get into the Boston Globe once in a while.
Yep.
So if there's hope there, I hope that you will get your voice into the Boston Globe or the New York Times or CNN. And I'm going to write you a referral letter.
Thank you. But the New York Times, I think, is the voice of the blob. And I don't think I'm welcome on its pages. And if you've ever written an op-ed for the New York Times, which I have in the past, you know that it's an arduous experience in which very little of your original ideas survive. Stephen Kinzer is a genius at writing op-eds. And he's also a very wonderful human being. So I'm glad you had him on for a webinar.
Just a quick question to add on, which is the point you made about Russian, or the fear of Russian aggression and moving into Europe. Could you just say a little bit more about what you would say to an audience where there were members? I'm not sure if any are here on this call, but so many Americans, so many Europeans are caught up in that fear. But what do you think is the actual reality that they could do that?
Well, I think they've shown on the battlefields of Ukraine that they can hold their own on the local level. They've ground up Ukraine pretty thoroughly, and they've taken, now it's about 20% of Ukraine's territory, and they're on the offensive at the moment, with the Ukrainian forces retreating in a somewhat disorderly fashion, which does not bode well for Ukraine. Whether it gets more weapons from us or not, or more money, is not the decisive factor. Ukraine has run out of Ukrainian cannon fodder, basically. Too many people have died. But the other side of that is that Russia, first of all, as I said, it conducted a limited operation in Ukraine. It did not mobilize the sort of forces that it could have to go after all of Ukraine. And it got pretty badly battered in its initial attacks on Ukraine. So, basically, the Russians have shown they can't invade NATO. They don't have the capability, even if they had the ambition. And I'd finally note that, the whole history of the post-Cold War era was one in which NATO was advancing, our sphere of influence was advancing toward Russia. Russia was not trying to take back its previous sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. What it didn't want is us to take it. And a final point is just relevant to the talk. When Ukraine became independent in 1992, I believe, 1991, 92, it was explicitly a neutral state. And it was we, Americans, the George W. Bush administration, that insisted that Ukraine become part of NATO. That was resisted by many other NATO members, and it divided Ukrainians. They weren't all united behind that idea. So the notion that somehow Russia, has a sense of manifest destiny similar to the one that we did to march all across Europe is not there. I would say finally that, just to expand a little bit on the lessons of the 20th century, maybe to start with the 19th century. After the Napoleonic Wars, the victors had the cleverness to invite the losers, the French, to take part in the concert of Europe. There was a Congress of Vienna meeting, 1815. The French were reincorporated into the Councils of European Management, and there was no major war in Europe for 100 years, not until 1914. I mean, there were small conflicts, the Franco-Prussian War, the Crimean War, but generally speaking, Europe was at peace. After World War I, we deliberately excluded Germany, a great power, from the councils of Europe. That didn't work out too well. It led directly to World War II. We also excluded the new Bolshevik regime in Russia, the other great power, and that didn't work out too well because it contributed to World War II and it then led to the Cold War. So the lesson is you have to be inclusive. And fear-mongering about aggression by anybody, whether it's by the Russians or us, after all, the Russians are not unique in breaking international law or ignoring the UN Charter. We went into Iraq, which was clearly illegal. We weren't able to talk NATO to go in there with us, interestingly. But we had some differences with our European allies. You remember the silliness about renaming French fries freedom fries and all this stuff. I mean, you can't make this kind of stuff up. So I would say, we need to be realistic. We need to look at what is there and not exercise our imagination or, as I said, inhale our own propaganda about the demonic nature of Vladimir Putin or take our view of the Russians from Bullwinkle and Boris and Natasha.
Oh, those were the days.
It was a great cartoon series.
They were something.
It operated at 3 or 4 levels. You could enjoy it as a kid. You could enjoy it as a literary set of references, and you could enjoy it as an adult that got jokes that kids didn't get.
Yeah, there'll never be another Rocky and his friends. Next question from Mary Ellen Kirkelos.
Need to, there you are. Okay.
There I go. Thank you so much, Ambassador Freeman. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's incredibly important. Everyone is recognizing that. I have a question that kind of the answer will be moot, but at the start of the war, at the beginning of when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was an understandable groundswell of support for Ukraine. And many people believed, I certainly thought that the Ukrainians had every right to self-defense, but was caught in a bind because it was understandable for people to want to send them weapons, but at the same time thinking that the U.S. would do such a thing and simultaneously de-escalate obviously it wouldn't have happened. Was there a way of getting out of this bind by simultaneously helping the Ukrainians, but also coming to some kind of agreement with Russia?
Yeah, I think there was. I mean, not only was the early April, late March draft treaty a demonstration that there could be peace. I mean, in that treaty, as I said, Russia agreed to withdraw from Ukraine. Ukraine agreed to become neutral. And that was negotiated, mediated by the Turks and the then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who had very good ties to both the Kremlin and the president and to Zelensky in Kyiv. I think there was a moment in the summer of maybe August of 2022. Ukrainians initially did very well on the battlefield. They had been well trained. They were brave. They were innovative, and they held their own against the Russians. And they actually improved their bargaining position, I think. Had there been a negotiation then, they might have been able to get better terms than they're going to get, much better. But the problem has been from the beginning that we have refused to talk. We have just said, no, you're out of order. We're not talking to you. And if there's any lesson from both military science and diplomacy, it is you never lose contact with the enemy or the adversary. If you lose contact with the enemy on the battlefield, you're subject to surprise attack. If you lose contact with your adversary in the diplomatic sphere, you're ignorant and you have no chance to make your case directly to that adversary. I mean, diplomacy is about persuading other countries to see things your way and to accept that their interests coincide with those that you're espousing. But you can't do that if you don't talk. And we don't talk. So we somehow think that it's a great honor and a gift to confer our presence on foreigners. Well, no, it isn't. It's a great utility to have the opportunity to speak directly to foreigners and learn why they believe what they do and try to help them change their mind. You can't do that if you don't talk. So that was the fundamental error here. The rejection of diplomacy at the outset and the continued rejection of diplomacy to this very day.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary Ellen. Next up would be Miles Flagg. Miles, do you have a question?
Yes. Oki Donatata Tansi, hello and greetings from Treaty 7 territory, Alberta, Canada. And the NATO Supreme Allied Commander is always an American. And one of the things I learned from a retired commander is that there's 5 requirements for NATO membership. One is that you're to be a functional democracy,
right,
and 2, civilian control of your military.
Right.
Now, in the United States, you have your CIA, which was created lawfully in 1948. And there's a special activities division, which has a license to kill. And as former CIA Director Mike Pompeo said, they can lie, cheat, and steal to accomplish their subterfuge. And in order to be a functional democracy, is it now time for Americans to outlaw the CIA?
Well, I think every country, including your own, by the way, needs an intelligence service. We made a terrible mistake in 1947 with the National Security Act that created the CIA, as you said, in 1948. In my view, by combining operations with analysis. You see the problem, if you rehearse the issue of the Bay of Pigs disaster, the analysts thought that this operation was not going to succeed. But the operators, who had been training Cubans to invade their own country, had become committed to that cause. And basically, the operators outruled or polluted the minds, if you will, of the analysts. And so I think we should, I think we need an intelligence service. We need to collect intelligence. What we don't need to do is run around the world doing regime change. And we got into that right away in the elections of the late 40s in Italy and France, where we were concerned that the French or the Italian Communist Party would win the elections, and we rigged them. That was the first act the CIA did. We went on to cooperate with MI6, the British intelligence service, in the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. We ended a democracy there and replaced it with the Shah, who lasted for a while. So I think you have a point. But I think the more fundamental point is not the institution, but the purposes. And I really firmly believe that you can have an intelligence service that collects intelligence and doesn't try to overthrow foreign governments. Now, that would be perhaps very un-American. If you know the history of a place like Guatemala, for example, we keep overthrowing the government there, and Honduras, and so forth and so on. And now we're trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela, for which I have no affection. But I think, it's up to Venezuelans to govern themselves, not us. So I basically sympathize with your objection, but I don't have the same answer.
Thank you very much. Let's take a question from Cole Harrison.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Ambassador Freeman, for this analysis. But in terms of the Ukraine war, in terms of where we currently are, what does the blob in Washington, how do they assess the situation? Why are they pursuing the policies they do? What is their objective? What do you think they're going to do this year?
I think there's almost a sense of panic now, not just in Europe, over the failure of the Ukraine war, but in Washington. And you have different reactions to this. I know that Jens Stoltenberg, who was very hardline, has now come out in favor of saying that basically Ukraine's going to have to make some compromises and negotiate. That is a concession on his part. In Washington, you have people who are completely committed to this war. One of them, Victoria Nuland, just left the government to accept a position as a professor at Columbia University. God help her students. I think there is a group of neoconservatives who are very, very hardline and who have the ear of the president and basically a hammerlock on much of the government. If you believe Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State, then you must accept neoconservatism as a philosophy, I guess. I don't see any difference between what he believes and professes and what Victoria Nuland, as his deputy, professes. So I go back to my answer to an earlier comment or question, and that is, I think this is a case where the people are ahead of the government. And in fact, I would say that is the phenomenon in our politics these days. When Hillary Clinton referred to the deplorables, some of my best friends are deplorable, but when she referred to the deplorables, it was not only a put down, but it was a recognition that there's a very large group of Americans who feel betrayed by the political elite, ignored by the political elite, and who don't share the values that the political elite is pushing. Not a secret that our country is polarized. And that polarization is very evident outside Washington and in the floor of the U.S. Congress, which can't get anything done. So you asked about the blob. The blob blobs on. You can turn on your TV and see Admiral Kirby anytime. And he's the epitome of the blob. So, but I don't think most people in the federal government who work on these issues, whether they're at the intelligence agencies or at the State Department, or even on the NSC staff, agree with this policy. So I don't know what to do about it except elect better leadership. And as I already remarked, the choice is not palatable this year.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go to Jeffrey Bachtel. Jeffrey, are you there?
It's Bark Dull, first off.
Bach Dull. Okay, great.
B as a
You're
boy,
on, Jeff.
A-R-K, D as in dog, U-L-L. I know I put some questions. I missed most of your speech because I was doing my chores, and I apologize for that, Kit. How do you pronounce your name, Cash Freeman?
Sorry, no.
Cash Freeman?
Yes.
Anyway, I got you can answer them in there, but I want to mention what one of the previous guys said about and overturning governments and all what we did. All that is I created something to help end that once and for all. It's a new I want to know your thoughts. That's kind of the question. It's called Crimes Against Democracy, also known as democracide. Like attempting to overturn a democratic government, or do like we did in Vietnam, Iran, even in South America with Chile. Those are crimes against democracy. And all that.
Jeffrey, do you have a question?
Well, that was it. I want to know what do you think of the idea of making that a law to help end these stuff once and for all.
Ironically, we already have such laws which prohibit foreign aid or military assistance to governments where democracide, as you put it, has occurred. And we don't observe those laws. For the most part, we ignore them. I would say, because I believe that constitutional democracy, meaning Republican with a small r, democracy, is in fact the best form of government we've yet developed. I strongly favor opposing any effort to overthrow it, whether that effort is here in the United States or by us somewhere else. But I have to say, at the moment, there's no evidence of receptivity to actually enforcing the very good idea that you've put forward. I just encourage you to continue advocating it, and maybe we'll come up with some way of stopping this from going on.
Okay, thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, Chaz. Next is Ambassador Freeman. Do you have? Can we just take two more questions? I know we're running pretty late here for you.
Yeah, no, I'm desperate to have a drink, but I will do that.
Okay.
After Mr. Zuckerman.
I don't want you to hold off too long on that.
Mr. Zuckerman.
Val, did you still have a question, or did you lower your hand?
I have a question here.
Yeah, is this Anatol?
Anatol, yes.
Yeah, go ahead,
I'm born in Ukraine,
Yeah.
but I immigrated to the United States 50 years ago.
50? Did you say 50?
Right. As you know, there was a two peace agreement.
But now I want to briefly talk about
What? I don't.
Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, Anatol. We'll try to deal with that noise.
Can I speak? Okay.
Please.
Yes, try again, Anatol. Sorry about that.
Okay, so as you know, that there were the two peace agreements called Minsk agreements in 2015. Both were broken. Do you know who and on which side this agreement was broken? And also, as you know, the Putin stated at that time he wanted partition the Ukraine. And now the Western countries accuse him that he's going to take the entire Ukraine and even attack the East European countries. What do you think about that?
Well, let me make a number of comments. There were two Minsk Accords, one in 2014, one in 2015. They both were premised on federalizing Ukraine, meaning that Luhansk and the Donetsk region, which had declared independence, would be reintegrated into Ukraine, but with the sorts of rights that Quebec has in the Canadian Federation. So in other words, the Russian speakers there would be allowed to use Russian, to educate their children, and to communicate with the government, contrary to the policies that the government after the 2014 coup had put in. So that's the first thing. Those Minsk Accords were sponsored by the French and Germans. Hollande in France, and Merkel in Germany. Later on, when Ukraine, Zelensky, by the way, Zelensky ran on a program of peace and accepting the Minsk Accords, which he repudiated after he was elected. But the Germans and the French later said, I don't know whether they were sincere or they were just saying something politically convenient. They said, well, we didn't really, all we were trying to do was to gain time for Ukrainians to arm themselves against the Russians. We didn't really mean the Minsk Accords, and we didn't support them. And the reason they said that is now, of course, Russia is demonized, so it's very popular to be anti-Russian. So they're basically saying, look, we were always anti-Russian at heart, and we didn't really take this seriously. Let me make a comment about, I could give you an account of the early stages of the war, which was very disorganized. The Russian invasion was not a pretty thing. It had every earmark of having been improvised at the last moment. Mr. Putin did not even brief his generals on his plans, which suggests he didn't have any. And he did not line up the logistical support for an invasion. And he told his troops they were on an exercise. He did not motivate them to do what they eventually were ordered to do. And it was a mess. The Russian performance was not good. Ukrainian performance on the battlefield was very good at that time. But I will make a final point, and that is Western Ukrainians, I don't know what part of Ukraine you're from, but Western Ukrainians are very nationalist, and they have a long history. And they are now the dominant force in Kyiv. And those Western Ukrainians, ultra-nationalists, have taken Stepan Bandera as their founding father, hero, the patron saint of Ukraine. And that is disturbing to others. Stepan Bandera collaborated with the SS, the Nazi SS, and the Ukrainian forces associated with him are said to have murdered 150,000 Poles and 250,000 Jews. So Ukraine is a divided nation, and it needs to come together. You can't bring a country together if you say that 1/3 of the people are no longer allowed to use their own language. Hungarians, you may not speak Hungarian anymore. You may not educate your children in Hungarian. Romanians, you cannot do that. Russians, you cannot do that. And as you know, there are other languages in Ukraine. It is a grab bag of many nationalities and ethnicities. It cannot be the prisoner of only one point of view, which is basically what happened. So I think the last thing on earth the Russians should want or do want is to try to control Western Ukraine. I think they would have an insurgency worse than the Afghan or Iraqi insurgencies on their hands. I don't believe they want to go farther. There's a question here. They illegally annexed Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and part of Kherson. Are they prepared to back off? I mean, I think the basic question here is, do we have any respect for the wishes and the will of the people who are affected by this war? You know, I said Crimeans don't want to be part of Ukraine. That's clear. Could we come up with a mechanism? Let's say we agree Russia abolishes the annexation of these oblasts and gives them, they have independence again. And Ukraine recognizes their independence, as does Russia, with the understanding that 20 years from now or 25 years from now, there will be referenda. So they can decide for themselves. Do you want to be part of Ukraine again? Do you want to be part of Russia, or do you want to remain independent? Why not respect the will of the people? Why not use a democratic process?
Exactly.
So that is my view. But I have to say, after all of the bloodshed and the demonization and the hatred, it would be very hard, to put Ukraine back together again.
Well, the East Ukraine people did have a referendum, but it was not recognized by the West. So,
Of course, of course. I mean, it's a very, you know better than anyone because you come from Ukraine, how complicated this is. It's not a black and white situation.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Freeman. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, everyone who's asked questions.